Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. Today we have a special podcast that we want to take you back in time and present a legacy podcast featuring Dr. Mark Laaser. A question that Mark used to get quite often from the wives of men that come here is, why is my husband a sex addict?
Absolutely. So in this particular podcast, Mark's going to be talking about those contributing factors that would lead someone into using sexuality as a coping strategy.
Today, Randy, we're going to talk about what I think is one of the number one most frequently asked questions around here, particularly for the spouses of, in our case, the men who have been unfaithful or who are addicted. And that question is, why?
Well, a very poignant but brief and impactful question.
Yeah, it's a very brief question. And one of the things that's interesting about that question is if the men don't really have a good answer for that, the wives will tend to keep asking questions about specific behaviors that they actually did. And I think underneath most questions are other questions.
Right.
And I'm really, in a way, talking both to the wives today and also to the men to say that we hope our show today will be slightly educational about helping you figure out the why question. If you figure out the why question, it really does, in fact, I think, help to decrease the number of questions that will need to be asked as a couple moves into the future. I think we should say that Debbie is going to be on the show in the future. She wasn't able to be available today, but I think she would certainly concur that answering the why question is incredibly important for the men to be able to do.
Well, I would imagine that in the minds of most of the wives, the why question so often includes probably a feeling of insecurity. Is it something that I'm doing that's of your why?
That's right. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. That the wives will tend to wonder, as you said, is it something wrong with me? Am I inadequate? Am I not pretty enough? Am I not sexual enough? Am I not a nice enough, good enough person? It must be something wrong with me.
You no longer find it.
Otherwise, why would you be on the internet looking at pictures, or why, in some of our cases, would you be out there finding other sexual partners? So it's really incredibly important to explain that addiction, for sure, goes back way before the relationship started. So this is not a show today about disclosure. We have talked about that before, and we have an article on this on our website. But one of the reasons why disclosure is so valuable is it does help the average spouse see that the why question, or where this started, actually goes back long before the man met his wife, and that's probably not a bad place to begin today in terms of trying to answer the why.
I think that understanding in the wife's eyes, or in her mind, understanding that this issue preceded her coming into the husband's life, I'm sure that tempers some of the intensity of the hurt that she's experiencing.
Yeah, I think that's oftentimes one of the results, one of the powerful things that happens after disclosure is that the wife does see that this is an illness, this is a disease, this is an addiction. It's not nearly as much about her as it is about the dysfunction that the husband brings into the relationship.
That last statement reminded me of last week's show. And I want to put in a little sidebar comment here from a technical aspect. Last week, for the first time in 6 months worth of podcasts, we had some technical difficulties with having Dr. Daniel Amen on the phone. And I'm in listening back to the show, I could identify those issues we have now ironed out, and when we have future guests on via telephone, I don't anticipate we'll have that same problem. But the point that Dr. Amen was making, and that you reinforced, is once a brain scan has been done on a person, the woman has a greater empathy for her husband, because she sees that there is some neurochemistry behind this problem.
Well, let's start with the neurochemistry part. And you're right. A lot of times when we've sent men out to have their brain scanned, we see that there are some diagnosable mental health issues. I was referring to a study that we did with a group of our alumni from the workshops that we do, about 100 of them, that demonstrated without a doubt that virtually 50% of all the men who have diagnosable sex addiction, when they come here for the workshop, they also have diagnosable attention deficit disorder, or as we call it today, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So there are some mental health factors that can obviously predispose an individual to use the neurochemistry that happens with sexual arousal as a way of trying to medicate their own attention issues, their own anxiety, their own depression. And that is one of the places we actually need to start looking, for the why question.
Because it can have such a strong effect on the why.
That's right. So we have any number of cases, for example, where the men are struggling with going to sleep at night, which is one of the symptoms of, possibly one of the symptoms of ADD. And they learn that self-touching, self-soothing, genital touching is medicating in a way. And those patterns can start as early as even 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. So some of the guys that have chronic problems with masturbation or self-soothing that way, the why question really starts with their own self-discovery about how they were medicating their ADD, for example. Also, some of the men, if they struggle with anxiety, let's say they grow up in chaotic homes, homes that were not particularly safe, perhaps there was physical abuse or emotional abuse or sexual abuse of some sort, they maybe also learn that looking at pornography and the sexual high, the sexual arousal, the adrenaline and the dopamine that are attached to that can have a very profound medicating effect on the chaos in which they're living. So a lot of the men, when they are young, they are rather lonely. They're not getting the nurture and attention from one or both of their parents that they absolutely need, as we all do. And they learn that, again, the high, the adrenaline that sexual arousal produces can be a relief for loneliness. So when we tend to think about these factors, we think about associations that are actually neurochemically, therefore neurologically wired into the brain. Back in the early days of our field, Dr. Patrick Carnes called this the arousal template, meaning how sexual high is associated with the relief of some emotional state. I think I've talked about this before on the show, but when I was 11 years old and saw my first pornography, I know I was a very lonely boy. I had a lot of self-doubts, a lot of shame. I had a lot of questions about being attractive or not attractive. And when the sexual high of seeing my first pornographic image came into my brain, it began to wire a connection between the relief of that loneliness and pornography. So looking at pornographic images at that point became the arousal template. And then later on in life, say you're 30, 40, 50 years old, and you feel lonely, one of the things your brain remembers is how it's neurologically wired, and the temptation there will be to look at pornographic images again, because your brain remembers that that's a at least temporary solution to the emotional feelings you're having.
The comfort that you received from that.
That's right, yeah. Now, there are other associations that are drawn. Some of the men, for example, we were dealing with a couple of these situations this past week here in our counseling practice. Several of the men had very distant, perhaps alcoholic, perhaps even deceased fathers. And somewhere along the way, one of the guys I was talking to yesterday was 8 years old. He moved to a new city. He felt very alone. His dad was an airline pilot, so was frequently gone. He finally found a friend. He was invited to the friend's house for the proverbial sleepover. This 8-year-old friend of his had an 18-year-old brother, and the 18-year-old brother came in the middle of the night and started to sexually molest the man that I was talking to. And this experience happened 4 or 5 times, until such point as he decided, quite rightly, not to have any more sleepovers with that friend, although he was never able to talk about it with his own father or mother. So he grows up, and while he does basically perceive that he is attracted to women, there's a part of his brain that when he's lonely for the attention of men, his brain has wired into it the association that sexual activity with a man is one of the ways to get the attention of a man. So in his case, he started going to bookstores where videos are shown and sexual connections with other men are made. And now he's wondering whether he's gay or what. And we talked about the fact that he seems to be completely oriented to women, but he still has this association that's kind of locked in his brain. So if his wife is coming in and doing disclosure and he's talking about all this same-sex activity, she's going to be asking the question, why? Well, the why question goes back to a very lonely 8-year-old boy who was missing his father quite a bit and found out that he could get the attention of an older boy by participating in sexual activity. So these connections, and they're literally neurologically wired into the brain, are one of the first places where we look for the why. So far, we've talked about the fact that a lot of times, for a lot of the men, associations are built into their brain that equate sexual arousal, the high, the neurochemical high that's produced in the brain when we experience sexual arousal, and using that neurochemical response to self-medicate ADD, self-medicate anxiety, self-medicate depression. And the association of that medication actually gets wired as a connection into the brain. It's what we call the arousal template. And that's something that we take with us into our adult life. So let's say that one of our people that we're working with is experiencing stress or loneliness or some kind of distance in the marriage. The distance in the marriage did not cause the addiction, but the distance in the marriage may trigger the man into the memory of what was the associated cure back when he was 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old. So what we need to work on, and obviously one of the things we do work on here in our program, is how to break those connections, and more importantly, I think, how to create new and healthier connections.
So when you're working with one of the spouses, or when Deb is working with one of the spouses, how widespread is her explanation of why? What, how many, because I'm sure that every situation from individual to individual, the why has a different answer.
Well, a different answer in the sense that they're different stories perhaps of sexual exposure, sexual arousal for the first time, sexual abuse in some cases that creates sexual arousal that also creates association. So it really a lot of the wives want to know why, like right away. They want to know why, like today, and it may take the men a certain amount of time in retracing their steps and understanding their history to be able to explain some of those associations.
Sure, and so I'm sure that the answer can be as unique to an individual as it is the uniqueness of their personal story.
That is right. So every story is a little different. But I will say this, that at our workshops, for example, we do a very extensive exercise in a man's personal history. And I've always found that as I sit in on those personal history exercises, by the end of the man's presentation of that history, I can pretty much answer the why question for them. And hopefully then I can teach it to them. And also in couples counseling, we can help the wife understand that, again, this is not about her. This is about a much older history that the man brings into the marriage.
I think that's a great point for you to be making in reference to, we've got a number of men that are out there listening to our program on a weekly basis, and we're starting to see some really encouraging results with men coming to our intensive men's workshops after hearing you talk on the show. Mm-hmm. And just a brief explanation like you just said, I think is enlightening in providing some answers, not only for the spouse, but for the man himself. Why am I experiencing all of this?
That's right. So I think the why question is important. Maybe we're being too hard on the wives a little bit now. It's very important for the men to know why, so they can understand the connections, associations, that the meanings that they're making, and it helps them get directed to make new meanings, new associations, new connections, and that's all part of the discipline of recovery and accountability as they move into the future.
A great point, because when men come to us for help, they don't come to us knowing the answers. They're seeking the answers. And so, I always find it, as you view these couples making great progress over time, to see them both come to a new understanding of how the man's personal history impacted his issues with sexual purity, and his wife's empathy for the situation seems to grow the more that she learns about his history.
Yeah, that can be actually very true. So there's a couple other quick things that I wanted to talk about today before we run out of time here, Randy. One of them is not all the men that come have some of these associations that go back to their childhood. One of the things we've learned since, particularly I think the introduction in our culture of the internet, is that the internet in and of itself, television, video games, has created a certain culture of boredom, I think. We have so much stimulation, so much need to have new things in our life. And, every year there's a new phone, there's a new game, there's a new show. In every, period of time over the internet, there's new capabilities of doing things on the internet. One of the effects of that is that the internet, I think, has created, a lot of need within a lot of people for stimulation. And one of the why questions for some of the men that come to us is that pornographic pursuits or sexual pursuits, because they do carry with them, in terms of sexual arousal, a certain amount of adrenaline, becomes one of the ways that the men medicate their boredom. So we are seeing a greater number of men these days that don't necessarily have, all of the provocative histories in the past, but, they're in jobs that are boring. So their jobs involve them using the computer. Their jobs are not challenging to them anymore. They're searching for stimulation. So even in the midst of work time, there are pop-ups that come, or a friend of theirs sends an email, and the email says, "Check this out." And when they check it out, it happens to be a sexually provocative type of website or whatever it is. What I'm talking about now is the why question. Is I think we're seeing a lot of byproduct of the rapid pace and all the new stuff in our culture, and a lot of men are needing to bring a lot of new stimulation into their life, and that's the why question for them. And in that case, the internet has been referred to as the crack cocaine of sexual addiction, because some of the images, some of the videos, some of the connections even through social media that can be introduced through the internet are really like crack. If you've been kind of lonely or bored for 30 years and your high school girlfriend contacts you on social media and says, "I've been thinking about you every day for the last 30 years, that's quite a high. And a lot of men have a hard time resisting really what is in effect the neurochemical high of that kind of experience. Just like cocaine can get a person addicted from the first dose, some of the sexual websites and sexual connections on the internet can get a person pretty hooked in and addicted almost right away. So that's another why factor that we have to look at. There's one other thing that I want to mention, and that is that I think every why question contains a certain set of emotions that a man is dealing with. And for him to answer the why question, I think he does have to understand that he's anxious or sad or lonely, or in almost every case that I deal with, he's angry at something. Angry at God, angry at himself, angry at the world, angry at culture, and, let's be honest, perhaps angry at his spouse. So not necessarily because the spouse is a bad, terrible person, just, an addict, brings, an incredible amount of unhealthy expectations into a marriage. And when those expectations aren't met, it creates anger, and anger creates entitlement, and entitlement leads to, sinful behavior. So it's incredibly important for all the men that we work with to understand their feelings and to be able to talk honestly about them, even the feelings of anger. So as we close today, let me just say that I really encourage the listeners to take the time that they need to understand their history, to understand the connections and associations that they've perhaps made even since they were children, to understand some of the ways that they might be bored or lonely or angry today. And the good news of all of this is that Paul was right when he wrote in Romans 12:2. We don't need to be conformed to the ways of this world, but we can be renewed through the transformation of our mind, so that even if our brain carries inside of it meanings, connections, associations, we know that through discipline, through healthy behavior, through healthy relationships, we can build healthy connections in the brain, and we can renew our mind by overriding all the old messages, the old connections. Healthy relationships with your spouse, healthy relationships with other men. This is all going to transform your mind, teach you new meanings, and you'll get rid of all of that old associations that are bringing up all of that old sinful behavior.
Thank you very much for listening. There again was a Legacy podcast featuring Dr. Mark Laaser, our founder. For those of you that are out there and listening to Mark's message for the wives, this is a good time to recommend that you visit our website, faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find many resources regarding this subject. Until we join you again, we thank you for watching, and we hope that this coming week will be a week for you that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.